This is not a policy speech. This is not a strategic recalibration. This is not the kind of nuanced diplomatic repositioning that gets walked back through careful back-channel conversations over the following weeks. This is a man who is simultaneously lifting sanctions on Russian oil, lifting sanctions on Iranian oil, and publicly telling America's oldest military allies, the nations that have stood with the United States through every conflict since 1945, that they are on their own. And I need you to understand the precise timing of what happened, because the timing is not incidental. The timing is the story. While 10 American service members were being treated for injuries after an Iranian strike on a United States military base in Saudi Arabia, while medics were assessing wounds and commanders were managing a real-time crisis, the President of the United States was on stage at a financial conference in Miami, workshopping nicknames for a waterway and telling a room full of investors that he likes to surround himself with losers. 2 stages, 2 realities. One of them involves bleeding American soldiers who signed up to serve their country. The other involves a man who just told the entire world on camera that the United States will no longer defend NATO. Not in a classified briefing where the implications could be managed. Not through diplomatic channels where allies could be prepared. Not through any of the institutional frameworks that exist specifically to handle moments of strategic transition. At a money conference. Sandwiched between a riff about renaming the Strait of Hormuz after himself and a boast about his son's superior genetics. And here is what nobody in that ballroom filled with financiers and deal-makers seemed to understand, or perhaps what they understood perfectly and simply did not care about. The rest of the world was watching. Every intelligence agency on the planet was watching. Every defense ministry in every allied capital was watching. Every adversary who has spent years probing for weakness in the Western alliance was watching. And the rest of the world just received the signal it has been waiting for. In the next few minutes, I am going to show you exactly what happened in that Miami ballroom. Why it is exponentially worse than any single clip circulating on social media suggests. And why the geopolitical architecture that has kept the Western world stable, that has prevented great power conflict, that has underwritten global trade and democratic expansion for 80 years, just cracked in a way that may not be reparable. Not because of a war. Not because of an economic collapse. Not because of any of the scenarios that defense planners spend careers preparing for. Because of a man who told a room full of financiers that NATO can fend for itself while praising the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia as a warrior and comparing his son-in-law to Henry Kissinger. Here is a way to understand what just happened in terms that translate to every context. Imagine you have a business partner. You have been in this partnership for decades. Multiple generations of leadership on both sides have invested in the relationship. You have built infrastructure together, defended each other's interests against competitors, invested billions in shared systems that make both of you stronger than either could be alone. The partnership has survived disagreements, economic crises, changes in leadership, fundamental shifts in the market. It has endured because both sides understood that the partnership itself was more valuable than any individual dispute. Now imagine that partner walks into a conference room filled with your competitors, your rivals, the very entities you built the partnership to protect against. And without any warning, without any prior conversation, without any attempt to negotiate terms or extract concessions, that partner announces to the room that the partnership is effectively over. He praises the people who have been systematically undercutting your shared interests. He lifts the restrictions you both agreed to place on your rivals, restrictions that took years to construct and required genuine sacrifice to maintain. And then, when someone in the room asks about leadership philosophy, he says he prefers to surround himself with losers because successful people make him uncomfortable. How many days pass before you start building alternative structures that do not depend on him? How many hours before you begin conversations with other potential partners? How long before you stop returning his calls entirely and simply proceed as though the partnership never existed? Hold that thought in your mind, because that is exactly what just happened at the Miami Financial Conference. And the calls are already not being returned. Drop your answer in the comments. How many times does an ally have to be publicly humiliated, publicly abandoned, publicly told they're on their own before the alliance is functionally dead? Is it one time? Is it 5 times? Or has that threshold already been crossed, and we are simply waiting for the formal announcements? Let us rewind the clock and examine the architecture of what we are witnessing. The tensions between the Trump administration and NATO did not materialize in Miami. They have been building systematically for months, following a pattern that becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence once you see it clearly. The sanctions relief on Russian oil opened a massive revenue stream for Moscow at the exact moment European allies were straining to maintain economic pressure on the Kremlin. The easing of restrictions on Iranian oil came while Tehran was actively striking at American assets in the region, while American soldiers were in harm's way. The pattern was already visible to anyone paying serious attention, to anyone willing to connect the sequential decisions into a coherent trajectory. Washington was not tightening its circle of allies. Washington was systematically loosening it. And the NATO allies who had spent decades calibrating their entire defense postures, their military procurement, their strategic planning, their domestic political calculations around the assumption of American commitment, those allies were starting to hear a message that no press conference could spin away, that no diplomatic reassurance could credibly contradict. You are not the priority anymore. You may never have been. But Miami was different. Miami was the moment when the subtext that everyone had been carefully pretending not to notice became explicit text that could not be ignored. Standing on a stage designed for deal flow and capital allocation, surrounded by the aesthetics of wealth and transaction, the President of the United States looked directly into a camera being broadcast globally and delivered what he himself characterized as breaking news. The United States would no longer be there for NATO. He said it with the energy of a man revealing a surprise business promotion, with the casual confidence of someone announcing a merger, not a man dismantling the most successful military alliance in human history. Not a man unraveling the security architecture that generations of American leaders from both parties gave their careers to building and maintaining. And while he was doing that, while those words were traveling at the speed of light to every capital on Earth, American soldiers were being medevaced from a base in Saudi Arabia after an Iranian missile strike. The dissonance between those two simultaneous realities was not subtle. It was violent. It was the sound of a system breaking. Receipt number 1. The NATO declaration itself. Let us be absolutely precise about what occurred because precision matters when you are documenting the end of an era. The president stood at a financial conference. Not a security summit where such announcements would be expected. Not a congressional hearing where elected representatives could respond. Not a NATO ministerial meeting where allies would be present to react. A venue designed to attract investment capital, surrounded by people whose primary interest was return on investment. And in that setting, he announced a fundamental, categorical shift in American alliance commitments. His exact words, and I want you to hear them exactly as they were spoken. We spend hundreds of billions of dollars a year on NATO protecting them. And we would have always been there for them. But now, based on their actions, I guess we do not have to be. He then turned to the room and asked if that qualified as breaking news. As though the dissolution of transatlantic security architecture, the framework that prevented World War III, the system that allowed Europe to rebuild from ashes and become a partner rather than a perpetual battlefield, as though all of that were a punchline waiting for a laugh track, as though 80 years of strategic investment were a setup for applause. This was not a negotiating tactic. I need you to understand this clearly because the spin will attempt to frame it as leverage, as the art of the deal applied to international relations. Negotiating tactics happen behind closed doors. They involve specific demands and specific timelines. They use ambiguity strategically rather than broadcasting clarity. They preserve the architecture while extracting concessions within it. What happened in Miami was a public declaration at a venue designed to attract capital investment, delivered in the same breath as pitches for personal business interests. NATO allies were not consulted before this announcement. NATO allies were not warned through any channel that this statement was coming. They were simply informed, along with every adversary watching the feed, that the security guarantee they've built their national defense strategies around for 3 generations is now conditional at best and fictional at worst. The silence from NATO response channels in the hours that followed was not confusion. It was not bureaucratic delay. It was the sound of more than 20 nations simultaneously recalculating their futures. It was defense ministers calling emergency meetings. It was intelligence chiefs reassessing every assumption in every planning document. It was the beginning of a restructuring that will take years to complete and will never fully reverse. Receipt number 2. The sanctions architecture being systematically demolished. While declaring NATO obsolete on that Miami stage, the administration has been methodically dismantling the economic pressure systems that Western allies constructed together over years of painstaking coordination. Sanctions on Russian oil, restrictions designed specifically to limit Moscow's ability to fund its military operations in Ukraine and beyond, have been eased. Revenue is now flowing to the Kremlin that was not flowing before. Sanctions on Iranian oil, restrictions designed to constrain the very regime that just struck a base housing American troops, have been loosened. Tehran is receiving funds that will finance the next strike and the strike after that. Consider the geometry of this for one moment, because the geometry is where the pattern becomes undeniable. You lift the financial restrictions on the country that is actively attacking American soldiers. You lift the financial restrictions on the country that invaded a European neighbor and is waging the largest land war on the continent since 1945. And then you stand on a stage and tell Europe that you will not defend them anymore. This is not incoherence. Incoherence would actually be easier to explain. Incoherence would suggest confusion, lack of coordination, competing factions pulling in different directions. This is a pattern. And the pattern points in one direction with absolute consistency, away from democratic allies, toward authoritarian petrostates. The president himself confirmed the realignment when he listed the nations that MAGA supposedly wants to protect. Not France, not Germany, not Canada, not Japan, not any of the democracies that have stood with America through decades of shared struggle. Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE. He said it out loud, on camera, at a financial conference. The realignment is not hidden. It is not being conducted through subtle diplomatic channels. It is being marketed. It is being sold to a room full of investors as a feature, not a bug. Receipt number 3. The performance itself as diagnostic evidence. Beyond the catastrophic policy declarations, the Miami appearance offered something arguably more alarming for anyone attempting to assess the decision-making apparatus of the most powerful office on Earth. It offered a window into the cognitive processes driving these choices. The president referred to the Strait of Hormuz as the Strait of Truth, then, when the room reacted, attempted to frame the slip as intentional, as a rebranding initiative rather than a verbal error. He told the audience, unprompted, that he prefers the company of losers because successful people intimidate him. He compared Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff to Henry Kissinger and called them a high IQ team managing the most complex diplomatic challenges on Earth. He offered to answer questions about sex, unprompted, at a financial conference focused on investment opportunities. He claimed to have achieved regime change in Iran while simultaneously acknowledging that nobody, including presumably American intelligence services, knows who is currently leading the Iranian government. He said oil prices might go higher and that things are not finished yet, a statement that sent specific signals to specific markets. And he closed his remarks by telling the assembled financiers that his son Don Jr. has the best genes of any human being he has ever personally known. Each of these moments in isolation might be dismissed as Trumpian theater, as the performative excess that his supporters interpret as authenticity. Taken together in a single appearance, delivered while American soldiers are being treated for combat injuries, and while the most important military alliance in history is being publicly abandoned, they paint a picture of a leader who is not operating within the boundaries of strategic coherence, who may not understand what he is saying, who may not care. The audience in that room laughed. The audience in that room applauded. The world should not have. If this breakdown is connecting dots that you have not seen assembled in one place before, if this analysis is clarifying a pattern that felt confusing when experienced as isolated news clips, you are already ahead of most people watching this situation unfold in fragments. Hit subscribe right now. This situation is evolving faster than any single outlet can track, and you need to be positioned to understand what comes next when the next chapter of this story drops. Here is the contrast that matters, the contrast that reveals what we have lost. Serious leaders, competent leaders, leaders who understand the weight of the office they hold, when faced with alliance tensions, deployed diplomats. They negotiate burden-sharing agreements through institutional frameworks. They use the leverage of American power to extract concessions while preserving the architecture that keeps everyone, including Americans, safe. They understand that the system itself is more valuable than any individual win. That is what strategy looks like. It is quiet. It does not play well on cable news. It is boring to people who mistake spectacle for strength. And it works. It has worked for 80 years. It prevented the great power conflicts that consumed the first half of the 20th century. What happened in Miami is the precise opposite of strategy. It is spectacle dressed in the costume of strength. While the president was telling financiers that NATO is expendable, that decades of alliance building were a waste of resources, European defense ministers were already in emergency conversations about continental security frameworks that do not depend on Washington. While he was praising Mohammed bin Salman as a warrior, NATO members were accelerating defense spending timelines, pulling forward procurement decisions, beginning the long process of strategic autonomy. While he was calling the Strait of Hormuz by his own name, actual naval commanders in the region were managing a real threat environment in which Iran controls critical choke points and American sailors are in genuine danger without the distraction of a president who treats their mission as content. This is the lesson that every competent strategist understands. You do not make yourself more powerful by telling everyone you are abandoning your allies. You make yourself irrelevant. And irrelevance for a superpower is not a negotiating position you can walk back when convenient. It is a catastrophe that unfolds over years and never fully reverses. What does this actually mean for your life? If you live in a NATO country, your government is right now, this week, recalculating its defense budget and its foundational assumptions about who will actually show up if Article 5 is ever invoked. That recalculation will cost money. Your money. It will mean higher defense spending sustained over decades. It will mean resources that could have gone to healthcare, to infrastructure, to education, redirected to duplicate capabilities that the alliance was designed to share. If you work in energy markets, the removal of sanctions on Russian and Iranian oil reshapes global supply dynamics in ways that benefit neither American producers nor American consumers. The president himself said oil prices are not finished going up. He said it on camera to investors. That was not a warning. That was a signal. If you are invested in financial markets, the signal from Miami was not confidence. It was chaos wearing an expensive suit. When the leader of the world's largest economy tells a room full of investors that alliances are disposable, that supply chains are unpredictable, that prices are heading higher, capital does not flow toward stability. Capital flows toward hedges, toward hard assets, toward arrangements that do not depend on American reliability. And once companies and countries restructure their strategic relationships around the assumption that America is an unreliable partner, those structures do not snap back when the politics eventually change. The new trade routes become established. The new defense pacts become institutionalized. The new energy partnerships develop their own momentum. The jobs and the influence follow the new architecture. And they do not come back. They do not come back because trust, once broken at this scale, does not rebuild on any timeline that matters for the people living through the transition. 3 roads forward from this moment. 3 scenarios for how this plays out. And I need you to understand that none of them restore the world that existed before Miami. Scenario 1. Managed correction through institutional pushback. Business leaders with exposure to European markets, military officials who understand what is being lost, institutional players inside the administration who still retain some connection to strategic reality. These actors recognize that publicly abandoning NATO while lifting sanctions on adversaries is a catastrophic error. Back-channel conversations produce some version of a walkback. The president reframes his Miami comments as negotiating leverage, as strategic ambiguity rather than abandonment. NATO allies, desperate to preserve some version of the relationship, accept the fiction because the alternative is worse. But the structural damage remains. European defense independence accelerates regardless of what statements are issued. The trust deficit is permanent. The words were said on camera. They were broadcast globally. They were heard by every ally and every adversary. They cannot be unsaid. The lesson has been learned. Scenario 2. Realignment hardens into doctrine. Other nations watch what happened in Miami and draw the logical conclusion that any rational actor would draw. If America's oldest allies, the nations that have been partners for 80 years, are expendable, then every bilateral relationship on Earth is conditional. Every security guarantee is provisional. Every commitment lasts only until the next speech. Middle powers begin building networks that route around Washington entirely. Europe deepens integration with Indo-Pacific democracies. Gulf states hedge between Washington, Beijing, and Moscow more aggressively than ever, playing each against the others. America remains the largest economy and the largest military by quantitative measures, but it is no longer the unquestioned center of the international system. It is one option among several. And in a genuinely multipolar world, being one option among several is a fundamentally different strategic position than being the indispensable nation everyone else organizes around. Scenario 3. The spiral that nobody wants to name. This is the scenario that defense planners are quietly modeling. Iran, emboldened by sanctions relief and by the public signal that NATO solidarity is fractured, escalates further. The next strike is larger. The next target is more sensitive. Russia, flushed with oil revenue and watching Washington abandon its allies in real time, presses advantages in multiple theaters simultaneously. NATO, uncertain of American commitment and divided by individual national calculations, fractures under the pressure of each member looking out for itself. The president, facing criticism and political pressure, escalates rhetorically and then militarily in directions that no institutional process controls. The system that prevented great power conflict for 80 years does not collapse in a single dramatic moment that historians can point to. It erodes. It frays. It loses coherence gradually and then suddenly. And Miami may be the moment that future historians identify as the point when the erosion became irreversible. Regardless of which scenario materializes, this is what has already permanently changed. The transatlantic relationship will never look the same after what was said in that Miami ballroom. Even if the president reversed every statement tomorrow, even if he gave a speech drafted by the most skilled diplomats pledging eternal commitment to collective defense, the lesson has been learned by every ally and every adversary on the planet. American security commitments are not structural. They're not embedded in institutions that outlast individual leaders. They are personal. They depend on the mood of one man on one stage on one afternoon. They can be reversed in a single sentence delivered between jokes about genetics. And that is a lesson that, once learned, rewires how nations behave for generations. You never, ever put your entire national security strategy in one basket when that basket can be kicked over by a single speech at a financial conference. And now, thanks to Miami, nobody will. The restructuring has already begun. The president did not go to that conference to start a war. He did not go intending to end an alliance. He went to network with financiers and praise authoritarian allies, and tell jokes about his family and soak up applause from people who profit from instability. But what he did, whether he understands it or not, is hand every adversary a detailed roadmap and tell every ally to find new friends immediately. He did not dismantle NATO with a policy paper. He did not end the transatlantic relationship through formal diplomatic channels. He did it with a punchline. And the punchline is going to cost more than anyone in that room will ever pay. Did Donald Trump weaken America's global position in ways that will take decades to repair? Or did he simply say out loud what the architecture was already showing? Is this strategic realignment toward a new set of partners? Or is this a man who genuinely does not understand what he is dismantling, who cannot grasp the weight of the words coming out of his own mouth? And when he says he wants to be remembered as a peacemaker, Does he have any idea that the world he is building looks nothing like peace? Drop your answers in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe right now because the next chapter of this story, the formal NATO response, the Iranian escalation, the market reaction, the domestic political fallout, all of it is coming faster than anyone predicted. This is not slowing down. Do not look away. This content is commentary and analysis for informational purposes only. It does not constitute financial, legal, or geopolitical advice. Consult qualified professionals before making any decisions based on the topics discussed.